All right, so for this tutorial, it's going to be a little bit more of a walkthrough and a less of a tutorial. So I'm going to walk through the Paintfx tool, which is something that I haven't seen too many recent tutorials on so much, so I thought maybe we could revisit it because it is a really useful tool. So I use this quite a bit when I need trees in the background or even some foregrounded trees and foliage, plants, things like that, although it's really useful. There's a lot to it, so let's just take a look at some of the settings and figure out what we can do to make a tree. And I'm not going to really have any pointed reference here. We're just going to go for it and walk through the tools and see which ones are useful. All right, so to create something in Paintfx, we go to Modeling menu and Generate. And what we're going to do instead of starting from scratch is we're just going to grab a brush. And this opens up our selection visor. And in here are all of the Paintfx brushes. And if you choose to kind of go through, you can find that there's just a wide range of stuff that Paintfx is able to generate. But we're going to just kind of concentrate down here in the tree mesh. And we're going to pick one of these to take a look at and maybe customize a little bit. And I think we're just going to start with this one here. Now, I will say that there are a couple of these which are a little... the reason for these little clocks here is the density of polygons that you can expect from this particular preset. This is a heavy, dense model. Here's a lightweight model. And what's interesting to remember about this one, and I believe this one, is that they're based on cards. So you do have to be a little bit selective about where you're starting, but you got a basic route. Here. So you have, oaks and birch and maples and pine trees. So you have an idea of where you can begin. So we're going to start with this oak just to take a look at what we can do. So what I'm going to do is double click this, and that loads that tool into our Paintfx brush, which is over here. Now, when you're in here, when you're in the viewport, you'll have the brush looks like this, and I believe if you hold down B, you can scale the brush up and down just as you would with soft selection or artisan brushes. But it's kind of hard to judge what you're going to get. And so what we're going to do is just, for the trees, when we drag, it's going to grow the tree, a single tree on a stroke, and I'll let go. All right, so what we end up here with is our Paintfx tree and a stroke down here, which is basically a NURBS curve. All right, so now what we want to do is let's take a look at some of the settings we have to modify what this is giving us. And you might say to yourself that this is not the best looking tree in the world, and maybe you're right, but if we get far enough away, I can guarantee it doesn't really matter so much. So that's why this tool is useful inside of Maya. All right, so let's take a quick look. There's a lot of stuff. Let's open up the attribute editor. There's a lot of stuff that we can actually ignore during this setup, because what we have to remember is the lineage of Paintfx. Paintfx came into Maya a long time ago, and that was when the Maya software engine was the primary engine inside of Maya. And Paintfx came onto the scene as a post-render effect that got applied on top of the rendering that you had already done, as it had its own rasterizing engine. That being said, there's a lot of the settings that refer back to that we can kind of ignore now. So let's take a look at what we can do. So when you first open up the attribute editor, you'll get the stroke attributes. Now the stroke attributes include a bunch of really useful things that maybe I'll go over in a different tutorial. But the one that we should be really sort of interested in here is the seed. Now display quality, just as I mentioned, really just reduces what the polygon count is going to be. But we certainly don't want to deal with that because we can handle the polygons, first of all. And second of all, we don't get a good representation while we're working with it. Seed is a randomization seed for all of the randomizing attributes that happen within the stroke itself. And you can see as we move the seed, we get a completely different tree. Now, what's important here is that once we set our rule set for our tree, we basically can apply a new seed to that tree and get something entirely new, but based on the same set of rules. And that's going to be sort of critical to sort of what we're going to talk about. towards the end of this walkthrough. All right, so moving forward, let's not worry about the rest of this right now. Let's head over to the brush menu here, which is this is named as the Oak White Leafy Medium 2. Not a big deal. So right off the top, you can see that there's different types of brushes. Some of these, basically, most of these don't matter so much anymore. If you're not using it as a post-render effect, we're only going to be worrying about the mesh. Now, the global scale is something that you can sort of easily adjust how big it is in your scene. All of these brushes come in at different sizes. Looking at channels, this isn't a big deal. This again refers back to the original rasterizer used for this. The brush profile is not something that matters so much for this. We have brush width, which we adjusted at the beginning, but these are for more distributed brushes, such as grasses and other foliage, things like that. Again, it doesn't matter for this particular brush. Twist is something that isn't going to affect our work so much. Thin line and multi-streaks is specifically for Paintfx hair, which is really useful. And now we'll get into the stuff that starts to matter, and that's mesh. And one of the first settings that we can do is our tube sections. And you'll notice that as I reduce this, you can see that that's the divisions around the axis of the tubes that are being created. So if you need a higher resolution tree, you can certainly bump this up. Let's just keep this low for now. Low-ish, right? 12 where it was. And then subsegments are for rendering, I believe. Subdivision before it gets rasterized. All right, so we don't have to worry about this so much. End caps is sometimes what you might have to worry about that, depending on what your stroke looks like. Here we can see that if I switch this on, we get caps on the bottom of all of our tubes. All right, but let's just keep moving on. We have thorns on the mesh. You can add thorns, and for flowers, roses, things like that. And then here, anytime that we see something that refers back to shading, this is something that we can ignore because it just won't apply based on how we're going to use this. So we have a whole shading menu we don't have to worry about. We have a whole texturing menu, something we can ignore. Illumination we can ignore. Once again, like the rasterizer would fake shadows and things like that. Shadow effects, certainly ignoring glow. And finally, we get to tubes. Now, tubes is where we can start really manipulating our stroke. So we have our tree here. And when we look at our creation set, this is going to refer to any of these tubes that are happening in the creation. So branches and what we call the trunk here are just a subset of branches. We're not going to worry about this. Once again, tubes per step refers to grasses and flowers and bushes, things where when you make one long stroke, you want a whole bunch of them to pop up along there. Tube randomization, of course, is something we want to kind of keep up there. Start tubes is 1, that's this beginning, and then segments is 15. So this is where you can add additional divisions along the tube, and sometimes increasing this does help with some things, but also as you increase it, it does become a little bit more out of control. So I'm going to keep this a little bit lower just for the sake of playing with this. So length minimum and maximum is a nice thing to deal with because sometimes your trees can end up very evenly circular, and while that is the case with many trees, adjusting this gives you a little bit more, a little bit more variation, and we'll see how we can kind of deal with this a little bit better. So let's get something like this. All right, so it's a little crazy in there, just a little bit nutty. All right, so as you can see, small adjustments can start to affect things very quickly. So your tube width is sort of based on the base of your tube, and the tube width 2 is the end of your tubes, and that's all of these. Your width randomization is something you can easily kind of deal with and understand. And as we move down through here, we have things like width scale. Now this graph refers to what happens along the length of this tube. And you can see, like, if I need this roots to be a little bit more prominent, I can pull my trunk in a little bit tighter and then make these root base a little bit more prominent. And that's how that works. All right, so moving on to growth. Oh, sorry. Elevation min and max is just how much your tree is going to lean, or your plant is going to lean. And azimuth min and max is kind of rotating or leaning in the other direction. All right, so that's enough of that. Growth is where much of this all happens, right? So we have some major settings here that we can adjust, and and all of these are fairly important. But the one we want to start with is probably turning off our leaves and kind of dealing with the structure of the tree itself. So when we turn off our leaves, we can see our branches and twigs. And twigs are things that come off of our main trunk, and branches are like they're like a subset of each other. Like one has to be there for the other. So you can, if you remove the branches, you're left with these twigs, and then the branches come off of those twigs. All right. So moving to branches, what we're going to see is that settings from one are going to kind of be reflected in the others, so that as we sort of figure out what we need to do, it kind of makes sense. So moving in to get a little closer view, you can see that our branches, how they kind of generally work. And as we can just drop this down, one thing you want to be really careful of with these number settings and split settings and things like that is you have to be very careful about ratcheting these up too high too quickly. So make really small moves on these. As you can see, like moving to 3 branches generates a really dense tree. And one thing we'd have to be really careful of is if we had leaves turned on at this moment, you can really kind of bring your whole computer to a screaming halt. So that's why we want to turn off leaves to sort of adjust what we want. One thing that you can do is you can see the branch split depth kind of defines how many times and where that splitting is going to occur. So you can sort of define how dense your tree is going to look by adjusting this, how many times these branches are going to split, right? So it might be that you have a low split depth and you provide more branches on those splits, and vice versa, depending on the type of tree that you're looking to create. Also, really important setting here is branch dropout. When we raise this up, we get branches that are basically trimmed, and this allows us to give a much more varying appearance to our tree, right? So we're getting in a better spot now. And these split randomizations allow us to continue to add variation to that. And split angle is something that allows us to go from a tree that's a little bit more upright and pruned to a sort of maybe a bush that splits. So this just adjusts the angle between the 2 branches when they do split. Okay, and finally, split twist brings these around. Now, if this is 0, they all sort of happen on the same angles, right? So what we do want is we want to have a twist that imparts variety into our tree, and it's pretty easy to get there. All right, so finally we have some other options. There's of course middle branch, which puts things in between the splits, and split biasing, but basically those are kind of what you need. And then after you kind of get a hold of how that works, you'll see that the twigs are going to be very similar here. So we can have number of twig clusters, which how many twigs are going to come out of this tree. So of course we raise this up, it gets more dense, we lower it, gets smaller, and you can see how they sort of come down the tree here, right? And what you'll notice is that there's a clear spiral pattern to this, right? And that's going to be defined in our twist as well. so we can see how to solve that. But if you're noticing that right now, then we can fix that. So we also have length, how long are they going to be, how far reaching is this tree, dropout, again, really an important setting, and then you have base width and tip width, and this just allows you to make, heavy trees or just like little light branches coming out. And then the start value here allows you to raise it up the tree. So trees that have tall trunks that have been pruned, maybe in neighborhoods, they tend to have tall trunks. And then, of course, some trees have very low starting branches. Right? So we can kind of bring this up. And then we have this twist. We have this twig angle, which allows them to droop. And one of the nice things here is that it will actually go against the floor. We do this, and then also a second angle for upper branches. So, this allows you to sort of define strength of trees and things like that. All right, so pull these in a little. And finally, this is the twig twist. This is where we get to impart more angle between when one is going to do one and the next one. So obviously, if we move this to 1, you can see that basically that means 180 degrees for each one. So we get tree branches on either side, which is useful if you need to make like an apple orchard or grapes vineyard for grapes on a vineyard. So by picking sort of a number that's going to be a little bit less repeating, we're going to have a better result here as it looks a little bit more random. Twig stiffness allows you to not have that bend, and that's that. Branching after twigs gives you some really interesting effects as well. So you can get really varied and interesting trees by just making a few of these adjustments. Finally, your twig length scale is something that allows you to, based on the position up of the main branch, you can sort of adjust the width and reach of the plumage of the tree, right? So I know some trees in my neighborhood grow a little bit like this, where they have kind of a narrow start and then get wide at the top, and then of course you have some that get much more bulbous like this, that kind of grow out. So you can kind of adjust that very easily. All right, so now we've got our tree in place. Made some major adjustments to that, and I'm going to go back and turn on the leaves. And so the leaves here are interesting. This particular default really needs you to go in and make some adjustments to this because it's very regular. Just like the branches, the leaves in the cluster, if you pop this up, again, you have to be really careful. They will duplicate very quickly, and they'll just go in pairs. Now, once again, for certain pine trees and things like that, you'll want multiple leaves in a cluster. And then number of leaf clusters really just determines how many leaves are going to show up between the beginning value and the end of the tip here, right? So we can adjust the leaf count, right? So obviously some trees are very leafy. Leaf dropout is another one that I think is really important. These dropout values really allow you to get that randomization that you want in foliage. So you can set whether, where your leaves are going to occur, and your leaf length is how long your leaf is, and then you have like a base width and a tip width as well, the leaf tip width. I think it depends on some things there. So you can give her some pretty large leaves. In this case, that is probably way too big for this tree, although some trees do have that. All right, so we get this setting. Now we have sort of number of leaves. Now it's kind of odd that some of these are split out the way they are. Leaf start, you would think, would be up here in leaves. This is where in the branch they begin. So some trees tend to be very airy in the center, and some are very dense in the center. So that's, between these two settings, you can kind of decide what kind of tree you're going to be dealing with here. So you have these leaf angles. Leaf angles are sort of the angles around the branch and then how they interact with the branch. Looks like my length should be like that. All right. Now, one thing that I do find useful, now they used to have, this used to be a setting, like this is just make sure that they always face the camera, which is nice, I guess, in some forest settings. But one thing that I think is more useful is facing the sun. Now, as we adjust this, what they'll try to do is they'll bias themselves to face a sun. And this is generally sort of how you find leaves a little bit more. It's not that they're completely random, so you can find a spot in here. And your sun direction is defined, again, up here in the growth. So if we wanted it coming from x, y, we just kind of put the same values in there. So it's coming from that angle generally, you know, so like this, and maybe that's sort of your southern angle, and you want your leaves to be sort of adjusted to face that southern facing angle. Now we can add a lot more detail to these leaves by adding segments to them, and that will split the leaf. And from that stage, you can add twist and twirl. I think that's actually twirling around. But there are, let's see here. Your leaf curl allows you to bend the leaf a little bit, right? And I find that these little bits of settings do quite a bit to help your shading. Just adding just a touch of curl to these leaves. And you probably don't need as many segments, but there we go. And flatness is something that allows you to adjust the leaves into tubes, which will be useful for different varieties of plants. We can make this flat leaf. And we can decay the size as it gets to the end of the branch, or we can actually increase the size, which may indicate that we actually get more sun on the outside of the tree. And we can actually randomize the sizes quite a bit. All right, so once we have gotten here, and obviously this is a weird tree, but you can understand how you can sort of go in this direction to find something. At this stage now, we can be kind of done with this. The rest of this here, stiffness allows it to droop a little bit, but the rest of this you can see is related to shading, and we can ignore that again. We have settings for flowers and buds, but that's for your own experimentation. Now, the last step we would make really is down here in behavior. And behavior has a couple of options for us. One being that we can use displacement, and that might be just adding some noise to it, which can be pretty aggressive. Wiggle, you know, whatever you need to do just to add a little bit of interest. But really down here, we have some interesting stuff in forces. Now in forces, here's our path. If we rise this, you'll see that it will head to our path. And we can use this for a variety of reasons. You know, maybe things get blown in some wind or some forces. We can have it get attracted to that path, which is different, right? It gets sucked down, which can be an interesting effect depending on what you need to do. Of course, it goes the other way. We can have it follow the curve. Oh, wait, it probably needs to. If that curve, if we had many plants on this, that would be that. We don't have a surface that we painted on, so we don't need that. Randomization is just adding more randomizing through there. Gravity pulls the whole thing down, right, which we can get some interesting effects there. So you can kind of dial that into where you want it to be. And we have some other deflection items, but also here in turbulence, finally, is different varieties of turbulence that happen over time. So in this case, we can choose tree wind, and what happens is when you scrub through time, we get this displacement through the tree wind. So, you know, once again, turning down the turbulence, maybe turning up the frequency and adjusting the turbulence speed gives us a different variety of effects. So we have this blowing tree now. So what can we do with this? Essentially, now let's say we are happy with our tree. And this is a good thing. If we look at our outliner, you can see that this exists as a stroke and a curve. The stroke exists on this curve. So what we can do now is we can select our tree, and we can say for other rendering engines such as V-Ray or Mental Ray, RenderMan, etc., we need this to be in polygons. So we're going to go to our Modify, Convert, Paintfx to Polygons. And if you check the option box here, you have a couple options. You have vertex color mode. We don't want that. We want quad output. We can hide the stroke. That's fine. And poly limit. So here it's set to 0, which means it's unlimited. Otherwise, you can choose however many polygons you want. So I'm going to go ahead and convert this. And I'm going to close this, right? So now I've got here, this is our oak tree, right, as polygons, or whatever tree we wish to be having here. So now what we can do, let's say, if you wanted to have this animation, you could certainly just cache this out as a proxy for whatever rendering engine you're using, V-Ray, RenderMan, etc. But if you just need a still tree, we can do this as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select this group, and I'm just going to duplicate it, and I'm going to, where's my, lost my widget there. Interesting. All right, so what I'm going to do is just move this off to one side down the x-axis. Right, so now I've got a tree. It's just a duplicate of the tree that I just made. And it's got no history, so the animation doesn't exist on it anymore. And one thing you want to note is that this is a mesh, and if we look at our UV editor, it splits the mesh into two meshes. One which is a leaf mesh, and one which is a branch mesh. And the branch mesh, you can see, extends in the across the UVs, and every branch exists on this same mesh, as does the leaves. The leaves exist all on this one in the same UV space. So if you want to adjust that, there are scripts out there which will take these UVs and randomize into 4 or 6 locations or so. So you can have multiple leaves on your tree. But for this case, we're just going to keep it just as is. All right, so this is our tree as such. And now we can go back to our stroke, right? And we can go to our seed value again, and we can make this adjustment. Now that we have a tree that exists based on a set of rules, we can go and find a seed that provides something, maybe pretty different. Something that just a little bit of variety in here. A big split in the middle would be interesting, right? And we can take that tree and we can duplicate that, Command D, and of course, can't move it there. Translate X, there we are. And I can move this one here, right? So here now we have 2 trees, right? Now we can go back again, and I can say, oops, let me get our stroke here. One more time, I'm going to adjust this seed to find something a little bit different. Maybe there. And I will, once again, select this group, duplicate it, and move it out here. Right? So essentially what I've done is, once you kind of center up on one type of foliage, you can create a set of variety, a variety off of that. And this is important. So I'm going to hide my animated tree and my original Paintfx trees. And I have these 3 trees. I can do this with a whole variety of different plants and create a library of a set of a few of these. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to take these leaves, and I have a material made. Well, let me just show this real quick. What happens here is it makes a set of pretty bad materials to put on your tree as placeholders. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to apply, oops, I grab these leaves, and I'm going to go ahead and apply a existing material tree leaf, and I have one here for the bark as well. Existing material tree bark. All right, so now that I have these with materials, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to center these trees. All right, and now what I can do is I can instance these across a scene, right? So in my outliner here, I'm going to go ahead and group these and call them trees and open this up. And what I've done is I've already set this up. If you're curious, I have an instancing tutorial also on my channel list here. So if I unhide my ground plane, what I've got on my ground plane is a particle generator, which generates particles on the plane here that exist like this, these little white dots we can see. And I'm going to select my trees and my particles, and I'm going to go up to my effects menu and choose nParticles Instancer. And I'm going to go ahead and choose this option box. And what I've done here is remove that. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to make a change here, which is a level of detail. I'm going to switch to bounding box. And what that will do is create bounding boxes for the instances instead of the full geometry. And I've gone ahead and I've set up indexing as well as rotation, which gives it random rotation around the y-axis. And I've also set up a randomizing scale. And I'm going to go ahead and apply that. Oops, I chose the wrong thing under my instancer, so I'm going to go ahead and adjust that to bounding boxes. There we go. And that shows me all where my trees are going to go. And I can go ahead and hide my original ones. And so at this stage, and just so you can see it, I added these per particle attributes here. And here is my script for that, just a simple uniform scale across the way, a little bit of randomization on all axes and fully around on the y, and my instancing chooses between 0 and 2. So I only have 3 trees here. So here are my trees being instanced, and I can go ahead and just let this run. And you can see that I can generate quite a few trees very easily without too much slowdown. I am recording, so there's that slowdown. And with the leaves and the tree bark shader on there, hide my light, I can go ahead and render this out. And so this will send us over to RenderMan. Let me bring up it, and here is our trees. So that's 3 trees instanced. I don't think I have too many instances here. Doesn't look like it. Yeah, 4,000 instances, which is not too much. But you can kind of see pretty quickly that that it can be very effective at good distances. So that is basically how to go ahead and work through the Paintfx settings to adjust and make a tree. With a little bit of experimentation, you can really find easy ways to make all kinds of foliage and plant life, and you can really quickly populate a scene using instancing that's pretty lightweight when it comes to rendering. So there you go. I hope that was useful, and I hope it was a useful, more recent walk through some of the Paintfx settings. And good luck using it, and until next time.